Corporal Ryan Torres had learned to read weather patterns the hard way during his 3 years on frontier patrol, and the massive storm front rolling across Kepler 442b's northern continent carried the kind of malevolent energy that could turn a routine reconnaissance mission into a survival exercise. The wind howled across the frozen wasteland with increasing fury, driving crystalline snow horizontally through air so cold it made his breath freeze before it left his helmet's ventilation system. "Command, this is Torres," he spoke into his comm unit as he trudged through knee-deep drifts toward the coordinates of an abandoned research facility. "Weather's getting nasty out here. I'm going to need to find shelter until this blows over." The response crackled through static that suggested the storm was interfering with communications. "Copy, Torres. Weather satellite shows you've got at least 18 hours of heavy precipitation incoming. Find somewhere warm and wait it out." "Understood." Torres out. The research station emerged from the swirling snow like a ghost from another era, its modular buildings connected by covered walkways that had been designed to withstand exactly this kind of weather. According to his mission briefing, the facility had been abandoned 6 months ago when funding for atmospheric research had been redirected to more pressing colony defense needs. It should be empty, powered down, and thoroughly uninviting, but it beat freezing to death in a tent. Ryan's military training had taught him to approach abandoned buildings with appropriate caution, but his scanner readings showed no life signs, no active power signatures, and no signs of recent habitation. The main airlock responded to his emergency override codes, cycling him through decontamination protocols that seemed excessive for a facility that had supposedly been mothballed. The interior retained enough residual heat to keep the corridors above freezing, though Ryan's breath still misted in the stale air. Emergency lighting cast everything in shades of amber and shadow, and his footsteps echoed with the hollow sound of spaces designed for more people than they currently held. He was making his way toward what looked like crew quarters when his motion detector picked up something that shouldn't have been there, a faint energy signature coming from deeper in the facility. Ryan paused, checking his scanner readings carefully. The signature was weak but consistent, suggesting some kind of life support system running on backup power. "Well," he muttered to himself, "either someone forgot to mention that this place isn't as abandoned as advertised, or I'm about to discover why frontier pay includes hazard bonuses." Following the energy signature led him through a maze of corridors that seemed designed more for research efficiency than human comfort. The signal grew stronger as he approached what appeared to be a medical bay, and Ryan could hear the faint hum of equipment operating on minimal power. The cryogenic section was a small chamber lined with 4 suspension pods, 3 of which stood empty with their systems powered down. The 4th was active but flashing warning lights that suggested its occupant was in immediate danger. Through the frosted viewing panel, Ryan could make out the shape of a person, apparently human, apparently female, and apparently dying as her life support systems failed one by one. Ryan didn't pause to consider the implications of finding someone in suspended animation in a supposedly abandoned facility. His training kicked in automatically as he activated the emergency release sequence, using his suit's power cell to supplement the failing pod systems. The chamber hissed open in a cloud of supercooled vapor, revealing a woman who looked to be in her late 20s, with long dark hair and features that seemed familiar despite being obviously alien. Specifically, the pointed ears that marked her as definitely not human. She was unconscious, her skin pale with hypothermia, and Ryan's scanner showed her vital signs as dangerously weak but stable. He wrapped her in his emergency thermal blanket and activated the heating elements, then began standard hypothermia treatment protocols while trying to figure out what the hell he'd stumbled into. "Come on," he said to the unconscious woman as he monitored her vital signs. "I did not trek through a blizzard to watch someone freeze to death in a fancy ice cube." Her eyes opened 20 minutes later, violet eyes that seemed to hold depths Ryan couldn't quite fathom, and she looked around the medical bay with the kind of confusion that suggested she wasn't entirely sure where or when she was. "Thalish ni coral?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the cryogenic process. "I'm going to assume that's not English," Ryan replied, continuing his work with the heating elements. "But if you're asking if you're safe, the answer is yes. You're in what used to be a research facility on Kepler 442b, and you were about 2 hours away from becoming a very attractive popsicle when I found you." She blinked, processing this information, then switched to accented English. "How long was I unconscious?" "No idea," Ryan replied honestly. "I just got here myself, running from a storm that's trying very hard to turn this entire continent into a skating rink. I'm Corporal Ryan Torres, Frontier Patrol, and you are?" "Lyra," she replied after a moment's hesitation. I think I was part of a research expedition. There was an accident, and I remember the emergency protocols activating, but after that." "Well, Lyra, your emergency protocols probably saved your life," Ryan said, helping her sit up slowly. "Though your pod's life support was failing pretty dramatically when I found you. Lucky for both of us that I happened to need the same storm shelter you were using." She looked around the medical bay with obvious familiarity, her gaze lingering on control panels and equipment configurations in a way that suggested she knew more about the facility than she was letting on. "The research team, are they here? Did they make it to safety?" "Haven't seen anyone else," Ryan replied. "According to my briefing, this place has been empty for months. What kind of research were you doing here?" "Atmospheric studies," Lyra said quickly. "Monitoring weather patterns and their effects on colonial agriculture. We were supposed to be here for a 6-month rotation, but something went wrong with our equipment, and there was an emergency." She trailed off, and Ryan noticed that she was shivering despite the thermal blanket and heating elements. He activated his suit's environmental controls, directing additional warmth toward her while trying to process the inconsistencies in her story. "Let's get you somewhere warmer," he said practically. "I was heading for crew quarters when I found you. Once we get you properly heated up and maybe some food in you, we can figure out what happened to your team and how to get you back to civilization." Lyra nodded gratefully, accepting his help to stand. "Thank you," she said, and something in her tone suggested the gratitude went deeper than simple rescue courtesy. "I don't think I would have survived much longer in that pod." "Lucky timing," Ryan replied, though as he helped her toward the crew quarters, he found himself wondering exactly how lucky it really was. The woman beside him moved with the kind of careful grace that suggested extensive physical training. Her knowledge of the facility's layout seemed remarkably comprehensive for someone who'd supposedly been unconscious for months, and her casual mention of equipment failures and emergency procedures raised more questions than it answered. But she was also clearly exhausted, still recovering from whatever had put her in cryogenic suspension, and radiating the kind of vulnerability that made Ryan's protective instincts override his curiosity. Whatever secrets she might be carrying, they could wait until she was warm, fed, and no longer in danger of freezing to death. "So," he said as they made their way through the facility's corridors, "on a scale of 1 to really bad, how much trouble am I in for finding you here?" Lyra glanced at him with surprise, and Ryan caught a glimpse of something that might have been relief in her expression. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I'm very glad you did." The crew quarters were more comfortable than Ryan had expected, with environmental controls that responded to his override codes and furnishing that suggested the research team had been prepared for extended stays. He got Lyra settled on one of the bunks with additional thermal blankets while he activated the room's heating system and checked their food and water supplies. "Not bad," he announced, examining the rations he'd found in the facility's stores. "We've got enough supplies for a week if we're careful, and more importantly, we've got heat and shelter until this storm blows over. Could be worse." "How much worse?" Lyra asked, and something in her tone suggested she was genuinely curious about his assessment rather than just making conversation. "Well, we could be outside freezing to death," Ryan replied practically. "We could be trapped without food or power. We could be sharing our shelter with hostile wildlife, or dealing with equipment failures that turn our safe haven into a death trap. Compared to those possibilities, finding a mysterious woman in a malfunctioning cryogenic pod is practically a best-case scenario." Lyra smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her, and Ryan felt something warm settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the room's heating system. "I think I'm going to like your optimism, Corporal Torres." "It's a survival trait," Ryan replied, settling into a chair near her bunk. "Though I should probably mention that Frontier Patrol regulations require me to report finding you once communications are restored. Nothing personal, but mysterious researchers in abandoned facilities tend to generate paperwork." "I understand," Lyra said, though something in her expression suggested the prospect of official scrutiny made her nervous. "Though I hope you'll give me a chance to explain properly before you file that report." "Fair enough," Ryan agreed. "Though right now, my main concern is making sure you don't relapse into hypothermia. Everything else can wait until the storm passes, and we're both somewhere warmer than an abandoned research station in the middle of nowhere." Outside, the wind howled with increasing fury, rattling the facility's reinforced windows and reminding them both that they were completely isolated until the weather cleared. Ryan found himself oddly grateful for the forced intimacy of their situation, and the way Lyra's presence made the empty facility feel less like a tomb and more like a temporary refuge. As he settled in to wait out the storm, Ryan reflected that his day had taken a decidedly unexpected turn. But then again, unexpected was pretty much par for the course in Frontier Patrol, and mysterious women with pointed ears who spoke multiple languages were certainly more interesting than his usual routine of equipment maintenance and weather monitoring. Besides, he thought as he watched Lyra drift off to sleep in the warmth and safety of their improvised shelter, worse things had happened to soldiers than being trapped in a comfortable facility with intriguing company and plenty of supplies. Much worse things. Ryan woke to the sound of Lyra moving quietly around their shared quarters, her movements careful and precise as she examined the facility's environmental controls. The storm outside continued its assault on the building's exterior, but the violent howling had settled into a steady roar that suggested they'd be staying put for at least another day. "Morning," he said, sitting up and checking his chronometer. "Sleep well." "Better than I have in months," Lyra replied, looking up from the control panel she'd been studying. "I hope you don't mind. I was trying to optimize our heating efficiency. The storm seems to be drawing more power from the facility's reserves than the standard algorithms account for." Ryan blinked, processing this statement. "You know how to reprogram environmental systems." "Basic atmospheric engineering," Lyra said with the kind of casual tone people used when discussing simple household repairs. "Most research stations use similar control architectures. I just adjusted the thermal distribution to account for the external temperature differential." She gestured to a display that now showed power consumption graphs and heating efficiency metrics that Ryan was fairly certain hadn't been there the night before. "We should be able to maintain comfortable temperatures for at least a week now, even if the storm continues." "Right," Ryan said slowly. "Atmospheric engineering, of course." He'd worked with plenty of scientists during his frontier service, and while many were brilliant in their specialized fields, most couldn't reprogram a coffee maker without consulting technical manuals. Lyra's casual expertise with systems that should have been unfamiliar to her was another item to add to his growing list of curious inconsistencies. "I found supplies for breakfast," Lyra continued, apparently oblivious to his confusion. "Though I should warn you that I took some liberties with the standard preparation methods." She'd converted a corner of their quarters into an impromptu kitchen, using equipment that Ryan hadn't even noticed the night before. The smell coming from her cooking area suggested she'd somehow transformed standard military rations into something that actually smelled appetizing. More atmospheric engineering? Ryan asked. Biochemistry, actually, Lyra replied with a smile. Nutrition optimization through molecular recombination. I may have enhanced the protein structures and added some mineral supplements I synthesized from the facility's laboratory stores. Ryan accepted the bowl she offered him and took a cautious bite. The food tasted like the best military ration he'd ever experienced, which was admittedly a low bar, but still impressive considering the raw materials she'd had to work with. "This is incredible," he said honestly. "Where exactly did you study biochemistry?" "Various institutions," Lyra replied evasively. "I've always been interested in nutrition science, especially as it applies to survival situations." "Various institutions," Ryan repeated. "On which planets?" Lyra paused, her spoon halfway to her mouth. "What do you mean?" "Well, you mentioned studying at various institutions, and your accent suggests you're not from the core worlds. I'm just curious about your background." "I've traveled extensively," Lyra said carefully. "Research opportunities take you to many different places." Ryan decided not to press the issue, though he filed away her evasiveness for future reference. Instead, he focused on the more immediate challenge of making their temporary home more secure and comfortable. "I should check the facility's perimeter security," he said, finishing his surprisingly excellent breakfast. "Make sure the storm hasn't compromised any of the external seals or monitoring systems." "I'll help," Lyra offered immediately. "I know the facility's layout reasonably well." "Reasonably well?" Ryan asked. "I thought you said this was your first time here." "First extended assignment," Lyra corrected quickly. "But we received comprehensive briefings on the facility's specifications before deployment." They spent the morning working their way through the research station's various sections, checking environmental seals, testing backup systems, and generally ensuring that their shelter would continue to protect them from the elements. Ryan found himself impressed by Lyra's competence with systems maintenance, though her knowledge once again seemed unusually comprehensive for someone who'd supposedly only studied the facility's specifications in briefings. "You missed your calling," he said as he watched her diagnose and repair a malfunctioning atmospheric processor using techniques that weren't covered in any manual he'd ever seen. "You could have had a great career in facilities engineering." "I prefer research," Lyra replied, her hands moving through the processor's control interface with practiced ease. "Engineering is just a tool for understanding larger systems." "Larger systems like what?" "Ecological interactions," Lyra said, making a final adjustment that brought the processor online with efficiency ratings that exceeded its original specifications. "How different species adapt to new environments, how technological development affects natural systems, how cooperation between different groups can create outcomes." Ryan woke on their third morning together to the sound of alarms echoing through the research facility and emergency lighting casting everything in urgent shades of red. The temperature in their quarters had dropped noticeably overnight, and frost was beginning to form on the interior windows despite the environmental controls they'd optimized the day before. "Power core failure," Lyra announced, already dressed and working frantically at a control terminal that Ryan was certain hadn't been accessible when they'd gone to sleep. "The main fusion reactor is losing containment stability. We have maybe 2 hours before total system failure." "How bad is total system failure?" Ryan asked, pulling on his gear and checking his emergency equipment. "In this weather, fatal," Lyra replied grimly. "The backup batteries won't provide enough power to maintain life support against the storm conditions." Ryan's training kicked in as he assessed their situation. The facility's emergency protocol suggested shelter in place during power failures, but that assumed backup systems capable of sustaining life support. If Lyra was right about the timeline, they'd need to either repair the reactor or find alternative shelter in conditions that would kill them within hours. Options? He asked, moving to the control station where Lyra was calling up diagnostic displays that seemed far more detailed than anything he'd seen in standard facility documentation. The reactor can be stabilized, Lyra said, her hands dancing through control interfaces with the kind of instinctive precision that suggested extensive familiarity with the technology. But it requires manual recalibration of the containment field generators, which means someone has to access the reactor core directly. Someone meaning me, Ryan said, recognizing the logic of the situation. Someone meaning both of us, Lyra corrected. The recalibration requires real-time monitoring of quantum field fluctuations and adjustment of 17 different containment parameters simultaneously. It's not a one-person job. Ryan stared at the technical readouts she'd called up, trying to process what he was seeing. Lyra, this is fusion reactor maintenance. Advanced fusion reactor maintenance. How do you know how to do this? She paused, her hands still poised over controls that were displaying information that definitely wasn't part of standard facility operations. I've studied reactor design extensively. Studied it where? Ryan pressed, and when? Because this level of knowledge requires years of specialized training and hands-on experience with technology that's classified above my clearance level. Lyra's expression grew troubled, and Ryan could see her struggling with some internal decision. Around them, the facility's alarms continued their urgent warnings while the temperature continued to drop. Ryan, she said finally, there are things about my background that I haven't told you, things that are complicated to explain. Right now, I'm more interested in not freezing to death than I am in complicated explanations, Ryan replied practically. But after we fixed, Ryan woke on their third morning together to the sound of alarms echoing through the research facility and emergency, lighting casting everything in urgent shades of red. The temperature in their quarters had dropped noticeably overnight, and frost was beginning to form on the interior windows despite the environmental controls they'd optimized the day before. Power core failure, Lyra announced, already dressed and working frantically at a control terminal that Ryan was certain hadn't been accessible when they'd gone to sleep. The main fusion reactor is losing containment stability. We have maybe 2 hours before total system failure. How bad is total system failure? Ryan asked, pulling on his gear and checking his emergency equipment. In this weather, fatal, Lyra replied grimly. The backup batteries won't provide enough power to maintain life support against the storm conditions. Ryan's training kicked in as he assessed their situation. The facility's emergency protocol suggested shelter in place during power failures, but that assumed backup systems capable of sustaining life support. If Lyra was right about the timeline, they'd need to either repair the reactor or find alternative shelter in conditions that would kill them within hours. Options? He asked, moving to the control station where Lyra was calling up diagnostic displays that seemed far more detailed than anything he'd seen in standard facility documentation. The reactor can be stabilized, Lyra said, her hands dancing through control interfaces with the kind of instinctive precision that suggested extensive familiarity with the technology. But it requires manual recalibration of the containment field generators, which means someone has to access the reactor core directly. Someone meaning me, Ryan said, recognizing the logic of the situation. Someone meaning both of us, Lyra corrected. The recalibration requires real-time monitoring of quantum field fluctuations and adjustment of 17 different containment parameters simultaneously. It's not a one-person job. Ryan stared at the technical readouts she'd called up, trying to process what he was seeing. Lyra, this is fusion reactor maintenance. Advanced fusion reactor maintenance. How do you know how to do this? She paused, her hands still poised over controls that were displaying information that definitely wasn't part of standard facility operations. I've studied reactor design extensively. Studied it where? Ryan pressed, and when? Because this level of knowledge requires years of specialized training and hands-on experience with technology that's classified above my clearance level. Lyra's expression grew troubled, and Ryan could see her struggling with some internal decision. Around them, the facility's alarms continued their urgent warnings while the temperature continued to drop. "Ryan," she said finally, "there are things about my background that I haven't told you, things that are complicated to explain. Right now, I'm more interested in not freezing to death than I am in complicated explanations," Ryan replied practically. "But after we fix this reactor, I'm going to need the full story." They made their way through corridors that were growing noticeably colder toward the facility's reactor chamber, a heavily shielded section that Ryan had avoided during their previous explorations. Lyra moved through the facility's layout with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going, using access codes that she definitely shouldn't have possessed. The reactor chamber was a marvel of engineering that seemed decades more advanced than anything Ryan had encountered in frontier facilities. The fusion core itself was a crystalline structure suspended in a web of energy fields, pulsing with irregular light that suggested the containment systems were indeed failing. "Beautiful," Lyra murmured, studying the reactor with obvious admiration, "though the design is more conservative than I would have expected from human engineering." "More conservative than you would have expected," Ryan repeated. "Lyra, what exactly is your background in reactor design?" Instead of answering, she moved to a control station that materialized from what had appeared to be a blank wall, her hands interfacing directly with holographic displays that responded to her touch like extensions of her own nervous system. "The containment failure is cascading through the magnetic bottle generators," she announced, her fingers weaving through three-dimensional control matrices that shifted and flowed around her hands. "But the underlying fusion reaction is stable. If I can resynchronize the field generators and recalibrate the quantum resonance frequency." She trailed off, her attention completely focused on manipulations that were producing changes in the reactor's behavior that Ryan could feel through the chamber's floor. The irregular pulsing was beginning to settle into a steadier rhythm, and the rescue ships arrived simultaneously, which created exactly the kind of diplomatic complexity that Ryan's military training had prepared him for in theory, but never in practice. His patrol unit's search and rescue craft appeared first, cutting through the dissipating storm with the aggressive efficiency of human engineering, followed immediately by something that defied every assumption Ryan had ever made about spacecraft design. Lyra's people's ship seemed to flow rather than fly, its hull shifting between transparency and opacity as it moved through atmospheric conditions that should have been turbulent but somehow weren't. It settled beside the research facility with the kind of grace that suggested it was negotiating with gravity rather than fighting it. "Well," Ryan said, watching both craft deploy landing parties, "this is going to require some creative explanations." "My team will be expecting me to maintain operational security protocols," Lyra said, checking her appearance with obvious nervousness. "They won't be prepared for human contact, especially not contact with someone who knows our actual mission parameters. And my team will be expecting me to follow first contact procedures that I'm pretty sure don't cover finding alien relief workers in abandoned research facilities," Ryan replied. "Should be interesting." His comm unit crackled to life with the voice of Lieutenant Commander Sarah Wells, his unit's commanding officer. "Torres, report. We show you as safe and sheltered, but we're reading some unusual energy signatures from your location." "Understood, Commander," Ryan replied. "I have a situation that's going to require immediate consultation with diplomatic protocols. I've made contact with a non-human individual who appears to be conducting humanitarian operations in human space." The pause that followed suggested Wells was processing several different types of surprise simultaneously. "Torres, please confirm. Are you reporting first contact with an alien species?" I'm reporting contact with someone who has been providing assistance during human colony crises without official acknowledgement, Ryan clarified. Someone whose people appear to have been operating in our space for years without our knowledge. Through the facility's windows, Ryan could see both landing parties approaching the main entrance with the careful movements of people who weren't sure what they were walking into, but were prepared for multiple possibilities. Ryan, Lyra said quietly, I need you to know that whatever happens next, I'm grateful for these past 3 days. You've shown me things about human nature that I hadn't understood from observational studies. What kind of things? That your people's capacity for acceptance and cooperation might be even greater than we hoped, Lyra replied. And that individual connections between people can transcend species boundaries in ways that have profound implications for interspecies relations. The facility's main airlock cycled, admitting both rescue teams simultaneously. Ryan found himself in the unprecedented position of making introductions between his commanding officer and an alien relief coordinator in a research station that had become an impromptu diplomatic meeting ground. Commander Wells, Ryan said formally, I'd like you to meet Lyra of the Altarian Relief Consortium. Lyra, this is Lieutenant Commander Sarah Wells, Frontier Patrol Operations. Wells, to her credit, handled the introduction with professional composure despite the obvious surprise of meeting humanity's first confirmed alien contact. Lyra, Corporal Torres indicated that you've been conducting humanitarian operations in human space. For approximately 10 standard years, Lyra confirmed. My people have been monitoring human expansion into this region and providing discreet assistance during crisis situations. Ecological disasters, medical emergencies, colony evacuations, situations where intervention could prevent significant loss of life. Without human knowledge or consent, Wells observed. Without human knowledge, but with human benefit as our primary concern, Lyra corrected diplomatically. Our protocols require non-interference unless intervention is necessary to prevent humanitarian catastrophe. Ryan watched the exchange while keeping an eye on Lyra's rescue team, who were observing the proceedings with professional attention but obvious concern for their colleagues' safety. Their leader, a tall individual with the same pointed ears as Lyra but silver hair that seemed to shift color in different light, approached their group with movements that suggested both authority and careful restraint. Coordinator Lyra, the silver-haired individual said in English that carried a musical accent, we have been concerned for your safety. Your ship's distress beacon indicated critical system failure and possible crew loss. I'm unharmed, Captain Thane, Lyra replied, though my mission was complicated by equipment failure that required extended recovery time. And now? Captain Thane asked, his attention shifting to Ryan and Wells with the kind of assessment that suggested he was evaluating potential threats while maintaining diplomatic courtesy. Now I find myself in the position of having established unauthorized contact with human representatives, Lyra said, her tone carrying undertones that Ryan recognized as someone preparing to take responsibility for decisions that might have significant consequences. Contact that has provided valuable insights into human psychology and potential for interspecies cooperation. Wells stepped forward, recognizing the diplomatic opportunity despite the unprecedented nature of the situation. Captain Thane, if I understand correctly, your people have been conducting relief operations that have benefited human colonies without our knowledge. Is that accurate? It is, Captain Thane confirmed. The Altarian Relief Consortium specializes in humanitarian assistance across multiple species and regions. Your people's expansion into frontier space has occasionally created situations where our intervention prevented significant loss of life. And you've done this without attempting formal diplomatic contact because most developing species find covert assistance less threatening than overt contact with superior technology, Captain Thane replied honestly. Your people's historical response to encounters with more advanced civilizations has not always been diplomatic. Ryan found himself impressed by the alien captain's tactful way of pointing out humanity's tendency toward suspicion and aggression when faced with the unknown. However, Captain Thane continued, Coordinator Lyra's experience with Corporal Torres suggests that individual humans may be more adaptable than our sociological models predicted. In what way? Wells asked. Lyra and Ryan exchanged glances, and Ryan realized that they'd become an inadvertent test case for human-alien relations. Corporal Torres discovered my identity during a crisis situation, Lyra explained. His response was to continue treating me as an individual deserving of respect and assistance, despite learning that I represented a species with technology and capabilities far beyond human current achievements. He adapted to the revelation without fear, suspicion, or attempts to exploit the contact for personal advantage, Captain Thane added. Instead, he focused on cooperation and mutual assistance. Wells looked at Ryan with an expression that suggested she was rapidly recalculating his career prospects. Torres, is this an accurate assessment? Commander, I found someone who needed help, and she turned out to be remarkably good at helping in return, Ryan replied. The fact that she's from another species seemed less important than the fact that she's dedicated to preventing people from getting hurt. And now, Wells asked, now I think we have an opportunity to establish formal relations with people who have been quietly keeping our colonists alive for years, Ryan said. Relations that could benefit everyone involved. Captain Thane studied Ryan with obvious approval. Coordinator Lyra, what is your assessment of expanded contact protocols? Lyra looked at Ryan, then at Wells, then back at her captain. I believe that carefully managed contact could be beneficial for both species. Humans have demonstrated adaptability, resourcefulness, and genuine commitment to humanitarian values. Formal cooperation could enhance both our people's ability to provide assistance in frontier regions. And personally, Captain Thane asked, his tone suggesting he was already aware of developments between Lyra and Ryan. Personally, I would like to request reassignment to serve as a liaison coordinator for humanitarian cooperation, Lyra said, her voice steady despite the obvious significance of what she was proposing. I believe I have developed sufficient understanding of human culture to serve effectively in that capacity. Ryan felt his heart perform complicated acrobatics as he processed what she was saying. You want to stay? I want to continue the work we started here, Lyra replied. Building understanding between our people, preventing crises before they become catastrophic, and demonstrating that cooperation between species can create outcomes that benefit everyone. That sounds like it would require someone with experience in both cultures, Wells observed diplomatically. It would, Lyra agreed. Someone who understands human frontier operations and can work effectively with human personnel. Ryan realized that everyone was looking at him expectantly. Are you asking if I'd be interested in serving as a cultural liaison for interspecies humanitarian operations? I'm asking if you'd be interested in continuing to work with me, Lyra said, her violet eyes holding depths of possibility that made Ryan's chest tight with anticipation. Officially this time, with proper authorization and support from both our peoples. Working together to help people and prevent disasters, Ryan said, thinking it over. Traveling between worlds, learning about different cultures, building cooperation instead of just maintaining peace through superior firepower. Among other responsibilities, Lyra said with a smile that carried starlight in its corners. Well, Ryan said, looking around at the assembled representatives of two species who were somehow managing to conduct impromptu diplomacy in an abandoned research facility. It beats routine patrol duties. 3 months later, Ryan found himself aboard the Harmony, a joint humanitarian vessel designed specifically for humanitarian missions in frontier space. The ship represented everything that was possible when two species decided to combine their strengths instead of competing. Human adaptability and resourcefulness merged with Altarian technology and experience to create something greater than either could achieve alone. Final approach to Colony 7, Lyra announced from the navigation station, her hands dancing through control interfaces that now seemed as natural to Ryan as his own equipment. Atmospheric processors are online, medical supplies are prepared, and the evacuation shuttles are ready if needed. Any word from the surface? Ryan asked,